never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with Mr. Dimo Christopoulos of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, Mr. Christopoulos, can you start by giving us some background on yourself? To begin with, where and when were you born?
I was born in Grand Rapids, October 18th, 1925, at Blodgett Hospital. And it was a pretty small hospital in those days, and it's not near what it is now. Mm-hmm. And my father had a restaurant down on Michigan Street at the time. And then when the Depression come along, he lost the restaurant, and we lived on Knapp Street, and we lost our house, and we finally moved to Burton Heights. And we went there, and then my dad opened a restaurant in Burton Heights, and we was there for a while. Then he finally opened another restaurant on Bridge Street in Grand Rapids, and we moved to the west side, and that's where I went to high school at Union High School, and graduated in 1943.
Okay. Now, how many kids were in your family?
There was 4 of us. I had an older brother and 2 younger sisters.
And did your brother go into the war ahead of you?
Yes, he was about not quite 2 years older than I did, and he went in in January of '43, and he ended up in the Air Force on the ground crew and different and medical part of it. And he did go to Cuba. We had air base there, and then I met him once when he was going to college in the Air Force there in South Dakota. I went to South Dakota to visit him, and then when I got back, I was already sworn in the Army, so I had to go in.
Okay. Now, let's go back a little bit to while you're still in high school, like 1939, 1940, 41.
40.
Before Pearl Harbor.
Yes.
Were you paying much attention to what was happening in the world?
No,
okay.
No. We had no idea things were going like that. Of course, in '39, when Hitler started, went into Czechoslovakia,
Poland,
and then into Poland,
yeah.
Yes, and then we knew something was up.
Right. Okay. And of course, in 1941, they actually go into Greece as well. So that's
think so,
May
yes.
of '41.
Yeah.
Okay. But basically, you're a high school kid, so you're not paying too much attention to that kind of stuff.
No, but towards your senior year, a lot of the fellows dropped out and joined the Navy, because you could be 17 and join the Navy in those days, and with your parents' permission. And a few of them did that, and a few of them signed up for the Air Force Reserve type of thing for schooling, and then to move on to Air Force.
Right. Now, do you remember hearing about Pearl Harbor?
Yes.
Okay.
We just had gotten back. We was going back to the restaurant on Bridge Street, and we had gone to church and Sunday school that day. And I went to the drugstore on the corner, and the radio was on there, and it said Pearl Harbor. I didn't even know where Pearl Harbor was. Never had heard of it before. So it was all new. And then they said that they had bombed Pearl Harbor.
Now, did they do anything at your high school then when you went back? Because Pearl Harbor's a Sunday, you go back to school on Monday.
As I recall, not much of anything, because it was all so new then, and nobody knew where Pearl Harbor was. Had to get a map and find it on a map. Yes.
All right. Now, as you were getting older, were you planning on enlisting, or did you figure you'd just wait for your turn and get drafted?
Well, I registered for the draft when it would be in October, and then that summer I worked with my dad in the restaurant, and then everything was rationed then, and then on Tuesdays, it was a meatless Tuesday. All they could serve was lettuce and tomato or cheese sandwiches, and when you run out of that, we just closed up and went home. And then after I registered, this friend of mine who used to hang around the restaurant. He was about 2 weeks younger than me. He came and told me, he says, well, I just went down to the draft board and told him I wanted to go right away. Now, in fact, he says next week he's going for his physical, going to Detroit. So I said, well, how come you didn't tell me about that? So I went down and told him the exact same thing. So we ended up on the train going to Detroit and stayed there overnight. And then when you had the physicals, we got separated. And then when I met him again at the end of the line, I says, well, I'm all set. Are you all set? And he said, the Marines rejected me. I said, Marines? I said, I thought we were joining the Army. And so he never did end up in the service, and I did. And I guess I'm kind of glad he didn't tell me the Marines was. Otherwise, I would have joined the Marines.
Yeah, you could have gone to Iwo Jima or someplace like
Yes.
that. Yeah. All right. So you've enlisted in the Army. Now, having gone and had the physical, then do you go back home and
Yes,
wait
you
for
had
something?
2 weeks then to finish up your whatever legal things you wanted to do. My father wasn't too happy about that because my brother was already in the Army. And so that's when I went to South Dakota. I took the train there to see my brother because I figured it might be a while before I saw him again. And then I got back, and then I left it'd be in late November or early December. It was December, early December. They left and went on the train, took to the Army post in Chicago. You know, I can't think of the name of it.
Well, let's see. They had Fort Sheridan.
That's it,
That's
Fort
up north
Sheridan.
of Chicago,
I
yeah.
went to Fort Sheridan, and while I was there, I was trying to get in the Air Force. Then I didn't make that because they had quite a few. So after being there for a week or two, we ended up on the train heading south and ended up in Camp Shelby, Mississippi.
And what town is that in or near?
And in Hattiesburg is the closest town,
Okay.
where they had signs on the streets, on the lawns, to keep dogs and soldiers off the lawn. They weren't too happy about it. Well, at Camp Shelby, there was 2 full infantry divisions there. So that'd be roughly 30,000 men. Then there was a WAC detachment there. Then they had an induction center. So it was really a big camp. And plus they had quite a few German POWs there too. They had a camp for them.
All right. And Hattiesburg is not that big a place to start with either.
No.
Okay. Now, how long did it take to get down to Mississippi?
I think 3 days.
All right. And what do you remember about the train ride?
Terrible. Slow, stop. We ended up on a car that must have been 100 years old, the last, from Jackson, Mississippi or someplace down, because Camp Shelby is in the very southern part of Mississippi. So I was there, and we started taking basic January the 1st, or the 2nd, I guess it would be, 1944. And we had 16 weeks of basic training.
All right. And what kinds of things did they make you do in basic training?
Oh, everything. Learning military procedures, going to classes, respecting officers and how to treat them, handling a rifle, how to dismantle it, forced marches, night courses, and then they would take you on these long marches. You start off we used to march out to a training area, and we'd get halfway there and we'd be all winded. Then after a week or two of that, you could go out there and back and never stop. And then they went on they had a 5 or 6 mile forced march, which you had a double time most of it. Then they had a 12-mile forced march, which you walked it in double time. Then the final one was a 25-mile, which you walked. You had to make it in 8 hours. And we did that at night, and a few of them didn't make it. So what few didn't make it would have to go back and do it again until they made it, 25-mile march.
All right. Now, how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to all of this?
Oh, I don't know. I was young and I was just 18, so it was all interesting to me, I guess.
Was it hard to follow orders and do what they told you?
Not really. I
Okay.
guess you just kind of get used to it.
All right. Now, did you get yourself into trouble and get KP duty or things like that?
The, well, I ended up on KP the first Christmas in the Army. I was there. I ended up on KP. But and then, of course, they took turns. They went down the roster, so you'd get it maybe every 2 weeks or so. But I got it then. And it was right after I'd had shots and stuff, so it really was, it was kind of a little bit on the lame side, but that got through it okay. And then you got your first pass to town after you'd been there a couple of months or so. And that's when I first saw grits on a plate and saw how the Southerners treated the Negroes down there. Of course, the separate drinking fountains, separate restrooms, everything was segregated, and it surprised me because here in Michigan then there weren't too many African Americans, and then seeing the way that they were treated there, they weren't allowed. Went into a restaurant to eat, and they weren't allowed in, but they could come to the back door, and they would bag a meal and sell it to them out the back door, but they could not come in there. And then if you was walking down the sidewalk, they would get off the sidewalk for you and stuff like that. You know, it was a different way. And then the bus, they had the bus that went to camp. Of course, they had some of the black people worked there at the camp. They had to get on the bus. There was chicken wire about 2/3 of the way back, and they had to sit behind the chicken wire. And when we first got on the bus, we went back there and sat there, and the bus driver came and told us who sat back there. So it was new to us, that type of thing.
Now, did they have any black soldiers on the base?
No.
Okay, just civilian workers.
The Army had not been integrated then. Out of our full division of 15,000 men, there was not one black in it.
Right. Well, there were black units they were forming
Yeah, they were all
separately.
black units,
Right.
but there wasn't any in Camp Shelby. There was an all-black flying unit. There's an all-black infantry unit that fought in Italy, I think.
And there were engineers and other things like that.
They did that, and your quartermaster and your truck drivers usually were black.
Right.
And who else was there in the service? You know, that's but there was none in our outfit.
Right. Okay. Now, after you complete your basic training, you're there about 3 months or so. What do they do with you next?
Well, then I got a furlough. It was 16 weeks. Then we got a furlough to go home, but they told us not to be late. And then when after we had our furlough, that would be probably in April or May, somewhere right in there. We got back, and then they came around and notified a couple of the other guys in our we slept in wooden shacks. That's all we had. No fans, no refrigeration, no air conditioning, nothing. Just opened up the sides, and they were screened, and that was it. For summer, and they had little round coal stoves, one on each end of the shack to warm it. So when I got back from the furlough, they called myself and several other guys in our platoon down to see the company commander. And we wondered what was the matter. So when we got there, we were told that we were cut off. They had a shipping list that men were going out as replacements. So we were cut off because we weren't 19 years old yet. They didn't want to send any 18-year-olds overseas. Apparently, they had some static of some of them being killed in combat. So I was cut off the shipping list, and I was in the platoon. And when I was in the platoon I was in, this friend of mine had a couple of words with the platoon sergeant, and I chimed in with him, and because we figured we were leaving. He was an old man. He was like 35 years old. Could you picture an old man at 35? Right. That was our platoon sergeant. Big Jim Logan. And so all the fellows all shipped out, and I said, uh-oh, we're in trouble now, because we'd be on KP every day. So the mess sergeant knew that I'd worked in a restaurant, so he came and asked me if I wanted to come to the kitchen as a student cook. And I said, certainly. I had to get out of the platoon. So I just moved my stuff to another shack where all the headquarters people were, and so I cooked for a month or so. They have 2 shifts of cooks in the Army. And then they says, well, we're sending you to Cooks and Baker School. Okay, and that was in Camp Shelby also. So I transferred there for 2 months and cooked there at the induction center, and then I cooked. There was an all black they were there because I cooked in their kitchen. Come to think of it, and they took I think equal to a 5th grade education half a day. In the military, the other half. And after so many weeks, if they could pass a written test, they went to service or they had to go into labor battalions. So I cooked there for a month, and I got my cook's diploma. So then I went back to my old company. When I got back there, the replacements had come in, and there were some cooks who had rank. So I was back in the platoon, back to Sergeant Logan again.
Okay, now, had Sergeant Logan forgiven you yet?
Yes, I think he was glad to see me back. So I went back with him and got along fine with him then. And so we had to go through our whole course. We did engineer work, mine detector work, put up double apron barbed wire fences. We had 2 flamethrowers, which we never used. And then we had a truck that had entrenching tools, a trailer with picks and shovels and the barbed wire, which, of course, George Patton didn't believe in that. He never stopped long enough to. And then we went on maneuvers, and then when we went on maneuvers out in the swamps, we were notified that we were going to go overseas as a division. So we left in December. We left Camp Shelby and went to Camp Shanks, New York.
So which division then were you part of?
I was still the same division, the 65th Division.
All right.
Yeah.
And had that been originally just a training unit? They would train men and ship them out?
They were training it to go as a complete division, but they were so desperate for replacements, they took all the privates and the PFCs out. And ones, of course, like I wasn't 19, they left me behind, and anybody who wasn't physically fit at the time, everybody else was gone.
Okay, so your division had originally been training just like all the other ones, but then they had stripped it for manpower to ship overseas, and then they had to rebuild it again.
They brought replacements in from all over the country, from different outfits, and a lot of Air Force men that were washed out, they sent them in too.
Yeah, because they had all kinds of specialized training programs, and the Air Force engineers, they shut them all down, put all the guys in the infantry.
They had too many, yes.
Right. So by the time you rejoined it, probably Sergeant Logan was happy to see you because you actually knew how to do stuff.
Yes, some of the stuff and the procedures, so we had to go through it all. We built rafts to float a Jeep across a lake or a river, and built corduroy road sections. That was before the days of chainsaws. We had 2-man buck saws, and then we had mallets, and then we had the stakes for the fences and other things like that. And plus we carried demolitions also with us.
So you're really getting a fair amount of engineer training.
Yes,
at least pioneer
we were
training.
basically the pioneers. The infantry is engineers of the infantry. That's their own. Yes. In fact. Well, go ahead. Yeah,
so that's so the specific company you were part of then, you're 65th Division.
Yeah.
And then what unit within that?
That would be the headquarters company, 3rd Battalion, the 261st Infantry. There's 3 infantry regiments in the division. There's the 259th, 260th, and the 261st, which I was in. Yes.
And then that in turn breaks down to 3 battalions.
Yeah.
And then you're in the headquarters unit of that.
3 rifle companies and 1 heavy weapons in each battalion. The Army's all 3s broken right down. Even they had 3 even the rifle companies had had 3 rifle platoons
right.
plus a weapons platoon. Yes.
All right. So you've got kind of the specialized work
Yes.
within that. All right. So you got all of this training. So now they're shipping you out.
Yes. So
Okay.
so we finally went to Camp Shanks, New York, and sat there for a while. And it was snow. We got there New Year's Eve. Now to unload boxcars, and then we did get a pass to go into for a 12-hour pass to go into New York City. So we went. I saw the Empire State Building and the usual things. Then back, and then when the time come to leave the camp, we took a ferry across to where the docks were, and the boat was there, and we loaded on this converted German liner. It had been captured out of South America and made into a troop ship.
Now, about how many men do you think did they have on that ship? Was your whole regiment on it?
No, there wasn't that big. I think there's probably the battalion, which would be 1,000 men were on it.
Okay. And then did you sail in a convoy or
Oh,
what?
big. So we sailed out of New York Harbor and got into a convoy, and it took us 11 days, you know, to get to, well, we were headed for England, but then they shifted our the advance party had left a month before we did to set up our billets in England, but they took and de-embarked us at Le Havre, France. We were about the first outfit that went in there, and there were ships sunk in the harbor, and a lot of some of the troops from other transports had to go by shuttle boat to get to shore. We docked someplace was a high dock and a gangplank, and we walked down there, and it was snowing and cold.
All right. Now, let's back up a little bit. What was the trip across the ocean like?
Oh, that was an experience in itself, I guess. You know, you had 2 meals a day, one in the morning and one and you had to stand up to eat. There was no sitting down. And as soon as you got done, out you went, and then the next outfit came in, and it was rough. This was in January in the North Sea, and it was pretty rough. And your food would be sliding around. You'd have to try to hold on and try to eat. And then about the time everybody got to the garbage cans to dump what trash they had, but most of them would upchuck there, and it was slippery sliding around trying to get up those steps and those steel deck plates, you know, and get in there and then get out and get some fresh air. And if you could, sometimes the water spray was coming over the bow of the ship, and you had to sleep with your clothes all on. And your life belt handy, because at night you could hear explosions, like there must be depth charges. Right. And the only ships that we saw for convoy were those little DEs, those destroyer escorts.
Right.
We saw them go by, but the transports are usually in the center of the convoy, and the supply ships and the other ones were all around the outside. I don't know how many ships were in it, but as far as you could see.
Right. So yeah, you do get it because they land you at Le Havre. All right. Now, once you get off the ship, what do they do with you?
We stand there and wait. This is at night, and it was snowing. And then the trucks came by. They were like semis, but there was no tops to them. There was just semi trucks. So we got onto them and started through some little French towns where they were shelled pretty bad and rough. And then when you come to a grade, they couldn't make the grade. We had to get out with our entrenching tools and shovel dirt and gravel underneath the wheels so we could make it. So at daylight, or when it finally was light, we got to where Camp Lucky Strike was, and there it was, a pile of tents in the snow.
Okay, so there's nobody there?
Nope. So we had to find out where the tents were, get the tent, and set those tents. So they were, I think, medical ward tents. There must have been 12, 15 guys slept in each tent. So we set the tents up, and I think we had some cots, but we didn't have a sleeping bag. We only had half a sleeping bag. We didn't have had just a liner or something, and then had one blanket, and there was no heat. So they would eventually, after a couple of weeks, try to make a heater. But the officers' tents, they had heaters in them. Well, funny thing happened is that the officers left their tent one day. When they come back, their heater was gone. They had a fire in it, and it was somebody in one of the outfits went in there and took the heater, the stovepipe, the whole thing, and put it in their tent. And food was scarce, so anybody had any rations, they usually kept them, or they tried to get out with the French civilians if you could find them but, you know, on the roads there, and maybe swap a pack of cigarettes for a loaf of bread. They had that long, skinny French bread, and so then they finally set some decent rations.
Now, when you first got there, what did you do for food?
We issued some K rations aboard ship. That's the box, look like Cracker Jack boxes. We were issued enough for 1 or 2 days.
And how long was it before they got food to you?
Well, probably 2 or 3 days.
All right.
So I skimped on mine. I thought if it's this rough now, what's it going to be in combat? So I really didn't eat all of my rations. I still had some of them left.
All right. And then sort of how long did it take him to make that camp fully functional?
It took a couple of weeks to get it, because the stoves for the kitchen were aboard ship in Antwerp or some other harbor, and they had to take trucks to go there to get the equipment, to bring the kitchen back, and then when they had a mess, a regimental mess, I saw guys pass out in the line from cold and hungry. Well, gee, they should have been in better shape than that. I didn't faze me that much. I guess maybe because I figured if this is bad now, what's combat going to be like?
Of course, some of those guys probably hadn't been in the Army as long as you had.
Well, they probably were, but I think they just weren't, I don't know, they just gave up a little too easy or something.
Could be. All right. Now, Camp Lucky Strike, I mean, they had been moving men through Le Havre for a couple of months and so forth before you got there.
No, there's nothing there.
Well, what had happened to the men who had been there before?
There was no men there before. We were about the first ones that went there. We were the first ones to set the camp up.
Okay. Well, I guess a lot of men had moved through, but they just unloaded and gotten on trucks and gone away.
No, there wasn't.
There
None had loaded there. The ones that were in France already were in from were farther north. I guess they were in from the invasion.
Well, I mean, you mentioned before that people landing at Le Havre, often they had to climb into landing boats and go in.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
That was from our convoy.
Okay. Well, anyway, I've interviewed men who were there before that, so they went through, but they weren't staying at Lucky Strike.
There was nothing there.
Okay.
No, it was actually a German airfield.
Mm-hmm. So they just piled the stuff up there, and you had to go set it up.
The tents were there, piled in the snow.
All right. Okay. So you built yourself a camp, and then once you get the camp all finished and nice and ready to go, what do they do with you?
Training, back to training again, marching, classes and things like that, and then then they, of course, knew that we were going to move up then. So we started getting our equipment together, and then we marched over to a railroad siding and put, was it 8 men and 40 horses? They were 40 and 8s.
Yeah, the boxcars.
Boxcars, and you could throw a cat through the bottom of some of them. There were big holes in them. And so we got in those boxcars, and we were pretty well packed in there. And then the train started moving east. It took a couple to go and stop and go and stop, and then we finally got to Metz, France, where we unloaded, and then we left all of the equipment we didn't need, like your extra stuff, duffel bags. They were left there, and then we moved up to the Saarbrücken, Saarlotten area.
All right, and then when you got up there, what was the situation, or what did your division do?
We replaced the 26th Division. They moved back out to for R&R, and then they finally went farther north, and we just took the positions, and the line companies that were down near where they could see the Germans, they would shoot back and forth at each other. Then they wouldn't, and then you wouldn't go out in the open because they had you spotted from their pillboxes. And so we stayed in some little bit of a town of some kind. I don't know what it was. But we stayed in this building, and we did guard duty, and we really didn't have an awful lot to do because everybody was just sitting waiting for the spring push.
Right.
In fact, one of the apartments on the end, I went in there and looked, and there was those 26th Division guys had butchered a cow right in the living room that winter, you know, and so that's where they probably cut it up and ate it. Parts that were still there.
Okay. Now, but you actually got to sleep inside a house rather
Yes,
than, okay.
for a change, yes.
Yeah. Now, was there a problem with that house, or
No, it was not.
how about noise?
Just that when they fired that howitzer outside of that's we all hit the floor. It scared us to death. That's the first time we'd been that close to her, and that was one of our 105s shooting at the Germans.
Right. But you hadn't noticed when you went in the house that there
It was
an
night. We went
Yeah.
in at night.
and the artillery was just right next to you.
We slipped. They didn't want the Germans to know that a green outfit was replacing a outfit that was combat
Right.
ready.
Okay. Now, how long was it before you actually got into real action?
That was probably about a week. And then we started the big push is when we made an assault crossing across the Saar River. It was early in the morning, and got on the German side and went up through there. And what had happened is the Germans had vacated most of the pillboxes. They had left, thankfully. And I think what happened is that farther north, some infantry outfits had broken through the Siegfried line and were going to work their way behind them.
Right.
So once they got behind the pillbox, it has no value because you could bomb it or
Right.
gas them out, you know. And so we went on through, got on the roads there, and we walked. And then we were sweeping the roads. We each had I had a mine detector on one side of the road, and my buddy had one on the other side. And the infantry outfits, the line companies were following us with a mine detector.
Right. Now, how well did those mine detectors actually work?
Well, I guess they wouldn't compare to today's, but they would pick up mines or big pieces of shrapnel. And what happened is that the road was all covered with shrapnel. And you couldn't stop, so we finally just turned the switch off. And we walked, but we just watched where you were walking. And then we got up to this little town, and we all sat down, took a break for smoke or ration, you know, I have a K ration. And a Jeep come by and just went by us, and it hit a mine.
Had you found any mines before you stopped?
No.
Okay.
No. Of course, anti-personnel, there were S mines. They were the ones we were more careful, because your vehicle mines, you can practically see them because they have to be on the surface. Otherwise, if they're below the surface, a tank can bridge them. But a truck or a Jeep would hit them and they would explode. And this hit a small mine, and it blew the left front wheel off and something else, and it injured the driver. But on the way there, we passed a Jeep laying off the road. It was the battalion commander's Jeep. His Jeep hit a mine, and it killed the driver and somebody in the front seat, and it wounded the battalion commander and another officer. They were blown right off the road. They hit a teller. Teller's a big German mine.
All right. Now, aside from mine sweeping, did you have in that initial push there in the river crossing, for instance, did you have any special assignments? Did the pioneers help the units cross, or did you just let other people do that?
No, we just went with them.
Okay.
We went right with them.
So did you have to, was the river already bridged, or did you just swim across
No, we
it?
went by the river. We went by assault boats.
All right. Okay. Now, once you kind of got then to that first town, you keep going. How long did it take to start running into Germans?
It must have taken a few days, because they were retreating, trying to get back to the Rhine River, because they figured that would be their big defense, was get behind the Rhine. So we just kept chasing them, and at that time I was a little farther back because of the line companies. Of course, the rifle companies are always out in front of you, and they had some action, but not very much because they retreated so fast.
All right. And then did you get all the way up to the Rhine, or did you have to stop before that?
We stopped once and had to clear a pocket out and stayed put, and then the notice came that to load up. We're crossing the Rhine, and we crossed the Rhine at Mainz on an engineered pontoon bridge. It was a real long one. And then we got on the other side. The convoy got strafed by German fighter planes, and then we took off again from there. Then the different outfits, every outfit was, you know, at that time they'd already captured the Remagen Bridge. That was farther south, and so Patton was real happy about that because he beat Montgomery to crossing the Rhine River. That was quite a feat for him because Montgomery said he was going to cross it, but Patton disliked him so much that he couldn't stand it because anytime Montgomery decided he's going to make a big push, he would get the majority of the gasoline, which is rationed to all the outfits, and everything would go to him, and Patton would be left stuck just sitting there waiting, and that really aggravated him, and he was really happy when he found out that the 9th Armored Division had captured the Remagen Bridge, and they were crossing it.
Right. Now, did you ever see anything of Patton yourself?
No, I
Okay.
never. Not that I can recall.
'Cause-
He gave a pep talk to our officers and that, but the enlisted men didn't need the pep talk. I guess the officers and the non-coms, he gave them a pep talk.
All right. Okay. Now, as you were moving, you're chasing the Germans to the Rhine, you go across the Rhine. What did the countryside or the towns look like that you went through?
Well, the big towns were in bad shape. Like Frankfurt, from the distance you could see the big buildings. When you got up close, they were only shells. No roofs, no floors, no windows, but just the outward walls. That's what a lot of them were.
And then what about in the countryside or the
The
smaller towns?
countryside wasn't bad. A lot of the little small towns weren't damaged at all because there was no need to, there's no need to, unless the Germans stopped there and tried to, fight. Otherwise, the small towns were not damaged at all.
Now, at that stage, did you see anything of the civilian population? Or did
Oh,
they
we
stay out
saw
of the-
them all the time. Yeah.
Okay. Did you have any contact with them, or did they just
Oh,
watch
we'd
you?
have the little contact. Well, they were leery of us because they'd heard so many how evil we were and that. And then, of course, the kids always come out and wanted chocolate. They'd always be begging for chocolate or cigarettes or stuff. Cigarettes were a big barter item, so they'd come around.
Okay. Now, did you basically just keep moving those whole last few months of the war from
Yeah,
place
we
to
would
place?
move and stop, depending where. Sometimes in convoys, sometimes walking, once and then in April, after we were supposed to have a couple of days R&R, and we were put on which we found out later was an open flank. The guys, we got into this little town, and the guys get some booze or liquor and beer and have a little party and drink it up pretty good, and a little rest, and cigars. They captured the cigar factories or some kind, and so we stayed in that. It was a Gasthaus, which is like a roadside inn. This town was a small town. It had dirt roads even, and so we got in this building, and we had beds upstairs, and there was like a little bar room downstairs with a couple windows facing the street. And so we started snooping around, and I found some bacon, and so I was slicing bacon and getting stuff ready for us to have. A part of the platoon was in there with us, only part of it, and 8 or 10 of us. So I had this stuff ready for breakfast, and so the boys were drinking it up pretty good that night and singing and having a good time, and I didn't feel real good, and so I was tired, so I went up and went to bed, of course, with clothes all on, and slept in the bed, and it was early, and it must have been 3 o'clock in the morning. The door opened, it was platoon sergeant came to me, and my nickname, they call me Chris. And Chris, get up. There's something wrong. I could hear shooting going on. I could hear mortars and different things. Something's wrong. So we got up, and it was pitch black dark, and we could hear all this shooting going on, and so we got the rest of the guys up, and we didn't go downstairs because we didn't know what was downstairs. So when daylight came, we went downstairs, and then this shooting and stuff was all going on, and then the battalion commander sent his driver up to the house we were in, which had closed. The courtyard was closed off by wooden doors, like, and the back of the house is a barn. So I'd found eggs back there, and we had this bacon, and so he sent his Jeep driver to get our bazooka team. We had a bazooka, and so he took two of the men and the bazooka, and he went with him. And just as he got there, I could hear shooting. I saw tracers going up and down the street, and I saw a tank coming down the street. Well, I said, well, gee, that looked good. I said, at least we got a tank with us. It went by the window, and it had a black cross. It was a German tank.
Oh.
It came right down the street, and it stopped where our battalion CP was down farther, and threw a satchel charge that blew part of the building down. The civilians had told the Germans where we were all camped and staying at, and where the battalion CP was, and then that tank took off down the street, but he made a mistake of running into an American tank destroyer. It shot him with a 90 millimeter cannon at like 10 or 15 yards, and it was a mess. I saw it a little later on. The turret was blown off it, and there were pieces of meat that were hanging on the telephone wires. We couldn't tell how many people had to do it. So there we are. We're surrounded, and so the platoon sergeant. So I took the bazooka men come back. The one who was wounded, and the other one I forget. So we took the bazooka, and our bazookas in those days, they were 2.36 inches. They would bounce off a tank. Anyway, so I went down part of the town, and then I saw a fellow that was shot and down, and a tank blocked. This TD moved out and blocked him, and they rescued him. And there was dead Germans and dead Americans in the town. So then, as far as I know, we was just on the perimeter. So then we went back to the gas house, and we trying to figure out what was going on, and then we found out that we'd been surrounded, and then we could hear airplanes coming in. The Air Force came and started rocketing and shelling the German tanks that were shelling our town, and then our own cannon, our own 105s in the next town, they sent their observer into our town, and he was pinpointing the fire, and they were knocking those tanks out. So about 11 o'clock, they broke in and got us out. And so the boys were pretty agitated about the civilians and that, and when we got in our truck, the Big Jim, that was the platoon sergeant, he gave me a thermite grenade. He says, throw it through the window. So we burnt most of the town down. They were so because of the civilians. And then I guess almost every building in that town was eventually burnt down, because we left and recuperated in a different area.
Now, was this the action for which you got a Bronze Star, or did that come later?
Let's see now. I got the Bronze Star at the Danube crossing, which would be later.
All right.
Yes. All right.
So we're not there yet. So okay. Now, after your unit has sort of was this really the first kind of serious firefight that you were in?
The first really big. In fact, it was supposed to be the last biggest German counterattack beyond the Rhine River.
All right. So you survived that, and then do you go back to just moving pretty quickly now?
We started on the move again. It took a day to move to a different town, and patched up some of the equipment and see if what happened there. And so we get our equipment all ready, and then we started off again.
Do you know what kind of losses your company or your platoon took in that first fight?
My platoon, the company took, the anti-tank company took 2 or 3 were killed. My platoon, my squad had 2 killed and 2 wounded.
All right. But anyway, so now you're moving forward. Now, as you're advancing, are you walking, or are you riding in trucks, or what are you doing?
I think then we were riding until we rode until we had to disembark and walk.
Okay. Now, did much happen between there and the Danube, or was the Danube crossing the next kind of interesting thing?
The Danube's the next big one.
Okay.
In between that, I don't remember anything real big happening.
Okay. You had mentioned before, did you see much by way of German aircraft, or just that one time early on?
We used to have a bed check Charlie at night. Once in a while you'd hear that. And I saw a dogfight over us, but I couldn't tell who was shooting at who. And then as we went along the Autobahn, the Germans had their fighter planes. They used the Autobahn for runways because the airfields were bombed so badly that they started using the Autobahn, and then they would back the planes off in the woods and keep them there. So we captured German planes that were just off the Autobahn.
All right. So then you get up now. When you reached the Danube, do you know kind of where you were? Were you sort of somewhere around Munich or someplace else?
Well, I don't know for sure. I can't remember. I'd have to look at a map to see. But we went, at one time we were the closest outfit to Berlin. And then Eisenhower had decided that it wasn't worth American lives to capture Berlin, and it would probably be in the Russian zone anyway. So he tipped us, and we started going southeast then.
Okay.
Into Germany, towards Bavaria.
All right. And so what happened then when you got to the Danube?
We got to the Danube, and so at night, they were supposed to cross at night, so we got there the night before, and we were or in the evening, and the assault bolts weren't there yet. And so the engineers were supposed to bring them in, but the road was so muddy and bad they couldn't get in, so we had to make a road for the engineers. We had to cut trees and we butt them, you know, what they call a corduroy road section, so that they could bring those big trucks in with those stacks of assault bolts. So they got in that night, and then sometime early in the morning, we made a crossing across the Danube, which it was pretty quiet. We didn't have any problem until once we got ashore and started moving inland. Then they started to pin us down. They pinned us down in the ridges and stuff,
Was that artillery fire or machine
artillery and mortar, and they were there's a big hill back behind us by the Danube, and so we could sit there and we could see the Germans shelling the gun positions back there. There was we had some overhead. There was an aircraft outfit. I think they were 40mm twins, and they were on that hill, and they were firing over us at the barns and some buildings ahead of us. And they kept firing, and pretty soon a smoke round landed just below them on the side of the hill. And they moved out, and right after they moved out, right where they were, a live round hit. So they knew it was time to get out of there. The Germans were really accurate with their mortar fire.
All right. Now, but for the infantry advancing forward, did they run into much opposition as they went up?
We got pinned down there. We got pinned down there all day. And we had kind of a ridge, and we were trying to dig some kind of slit trenches to get in. And then we had to have, we had to go back to see if we could get more ammunition and some stuff. And so I made a couple trips back. And the engineers were building they had a couple of assault bolts put together with planks like a big raft, and they had an outboard motor on it, and they run a cable, and they were going to go haul stuff across, and the Germans were shelling them. Those engineers, they would just keep moving, and there were artillery rounds or mortar rounds hitting there. And so I made a couple of trips back there, and then we got to a building that evening and spent the night in the building, and then the next day pushed out and started in from the Danube. We went towards Regensburg.
Mm-hmm. Now, after this, were you getting continued opposition, or were things quieting down now?
No, we were getting it pretty good then, because we were getting closer to them on their tails all the time.
Mm-hmm. All right. And you moved to the Regensburg area, and then do you go south toward Austria?
Then we headed towards Austria, yeah.
Okay. And where had you gotten to when the war ended?
All right, we went to Austria. Linz is the second largest town. We went through Linz. Then we were still going east, and we got to the town of Enns, E-N-N, and it's the Enns River, and that's where the Russians were on the other side.
Okay. So did you get to see the Russians?
We saw some come through. They went through to meet their shaggy-looking bunch, going to talk to our officers or something. But of course, Patton didn't like him to start with. In fact, while we were in Austria, a little old Austrian guy, he could speak English. He told us, he says, the next war you fight, he says, you're going to fight the Russians. That's what he told us then, and this is where the war had just ended.
Right. Okay. Now, as you're getting into those last couple of weeks, now, were you starting to get a lot of Germans surrendering to you?
Yes. Oh, they would surrender. They would put up a flag, and they would want us to, if we'd leave them alone and let them go, and get them a chance to pull out, that they wouldn't fight us. But the orders were unconditional. So they took the officers, German officers, come over and they blindfolded them, took them back to where the battalion commander or regimental, and then took them back, and then when they left, back to the war again.
But at a certain point, they do start surrendering, though, right?
Oh yeah. They knew they were gone, and they surrendered. Yes.
Okay. Now, what did the German soldiers themselves look like as you saw them when they surrendered?
They varied. They're kind of grisly looking, and they smelled awful because the tobacco they smoked was terrible, and they used to fight over American cigarette butts. If a GI threw a butt down, they would fight to get it.
Now, did they have older men or young boys? Or?
Yes. The ones we run across are old men and young boys. I think the prime of their army got it in Russia. So we had the older guys and a lot of the young boys.
Okay. But did you encounter any SS units?
We'd run across them occasionally, but they weren't too many of them where we saw.
All right. Because those guys, that's also where the better soldiers tended to go.
Yeah,
by the end of the war.
they pushed the other. They kind of kept tabs on the Volkssturm, the People's Army.
Right. Okay. Now, would the Germans try to retreat away from the Russians and toward you? I mean, did they kind of come toward?
No, they kind of held their ground against them, but they knew that the Russians are outmanning them. There were so many of them, and they kept pushing them. I guess they were kind of fighting their way back too until they got to where they were caught between us then. Right. So then they wouldn't surrender, but the Russians, if they could help it, they surrendered to us in convoys, cars, wagons, artillery pieces, all that stuff. German officers had their girlfriends in the big Mercedes. They were surrendering. All we did was put them in a big field and put a piece of wire fence around and told them to stay there.
All right. Let's see. So now, as you were moving through Germany into Austria, did you also start to see any prison camps or concentration camps?
And we come across them, and we'd break open the gates, and we went in. I went in one, and they smelled so terrible, and we walked in there, and there was one cabin. He's in cabin there. He was shack. He was standing over a stove trying to cook something. He looked terrible, and then we just backed off and decided to go. And the one come over by me, and he asked me. He says, "Where's the American Red Cross?" I said, "Back there somewhere." And we left. We don't even know what camp. I was in another camp where we broke into it and knocked the doors down. I was pretty good in those days. I could kick the door down with one kick, hinges and all. We broke them all open, and we didn't see anything there, and we left. So we just.
And did you see any sort of displaced persons kind of out on
yeah,
the roads?
they're all over the place. Had one day, we're sitting there waiting, and a big truck pulls up, and it had a Greek flag on it. And here there was a bunch of Greeks in there, and they wanted to go to Greece, and I tried to tell them in Greek or in English, they can't get through. Their Germans are there. So they hung around for a couple of days, and then I didn't see them again. Oh yeah, displaced people are just all over the place. Yeah, and another pitiful thing too is that, you know, the Germans used horses to pull most of their artillery because the fuel shortage, and the Air Force, there was dead horses along the road, just hundreds of them. They just machine gunned them because it stopped the artillery pieces from moving.
All right. Now, once the war ended, what happened with your unit? Did you stay where you were? Did you move?
We stayed in, well, it was in a barn. A farmhouse. We was sitting in a barn, and the platoon sergeant said, "The war's over." And a couple of the guys run him off. They thought maybe he'd been drinking or something. And then we found out it was over, and we stayed there a couple of days. Then we moved to the monastery at St. Florian. And we spent the summer there, waiting for our equipment. And then when the war ended, then we were disbanded. They had a big ceremony, and we were disbanded. And then I was transferred to the 9th Infantry Division back into Germany and spent the winter there. And the last place I was stationed before I came home was in Dachau. I was there for 2-3 weeks.
And what was going on there at that time?
That's when they had where they used to keep all the inmates. They had, you know, the gas chambers are still there. So that book I got showed the picture. They're still there. And they had 22,000 SS troopers. They were keeping them there and screening them, trying to find out if any of them were war criminals and if they were wanted. And so I got tired of guarding prisoners every day, and so our mess sergeant got the job of the calorie count for the troopers, and he couldn't do a simple arithmetic. And so he got me to help him, so I did the arithmetic, and that's all I had to do for a few days. Is we got the total and I guess divided it out by 22,000 to make sure they were getting the calories that they were supposed to get. And they were getting like 2 meals a day, but they kind of made big soup out of it, you know. And I had that pass, and that pass would let me in the guard. The Polish guards were a guard on the outside, and at each corner of the compound they had machine guns set up. Almost every night you could hear the machine guns shooting. And I think they finally took them away from those Polish guards and gave them carbines, which didn't have the range.
Right.
And so I had this pass, and I went in there a couple of times. I ate in that German kitchen where I was a PFC, and I'd walk in there, and them German SS troopers would stand at attention. And so I had a couple of meals there, and I had a shave, which about took the hide off me. And we were treated pretty well by them because they knew that we had something to do with their food, the mess sergeant and I.
Right.
Then after I had that easy job, then I had enough points, the point system to come home. So I just said, the platoon sergeant wanted me to stay and make a squad leader out of me. And I said, no, I'm ready. I couldn't get in the Army soon enough, and I couldn't get out soon enough.
All right. Talk a little bit, how long basically were you in Austria and Germany before you got to go home?
Well, got into Austria and into Germany the first time probably in March of 44.
Well, 45.
45, yes, 45. And the winter of 45, I was back in Germany, and in the spring, early part, and in April, the last of April of 46 is when I left Germany.
Okay. Now, So you basically you have the better part of a year spent in occupied Austria
Yeah.
and Germany before you get to go home.
And France, another month or so.
All right. Now, how did the people in Austria sort of act toward you? Were they different from the Germans, or pretty much the same?
No, they were friendly. They were quite friendly. I think of course, Austria, many of those Austrians were German soldiers. You know, they were in the German army. Plus, a lot of other countries had soldiers. You know, the Russians had quite a few that deserted communism and went in the German army. And there was Polish, and there was a bunch of other nationalities that actually were in the German army. And but the Austrians, they seemed pretty friendly. Austria is a beautiful country. I went to Salzburg and traveled around there a little bit.
And then the people in Germany itself, when you're there after the war, I mean, how did they treat the American soldiers?
Well, there wasn't a Nazi in Germany when the war ended. There was no. We used to go into towns and they'd have all the white sheets hanging out the windows, and if they weren't, we knew something was wrong. But I think they were fed up with it too. They could see it was a lost cause.
Okay. Now, did you get to travel around a little bit in Europe before you went home?
I went to Paris, had a 3-day pass there, got back from there, I was back again. Then I had a week's tour in Switzerland. So I went to Switzerland for a week and toured all of Switzerland. They were more hostile to us than the Germans were. They resented us being there. We were in the tavern, this fellow that I met in the GI, and we were talking. There's a couple of young ladies come over, and we were talking to them and getting kind of friendly. And these Swiss soldiers over there come over. The one come over, he was a non-com, had a holster with a pistol, and the other one said, they came over and they told us nice like that we weren't particularly welcomed in Switzerland to go back to Germany. So I still have, ever since then, I dislike Switzerland.
All right. Now, as you're kind of getting on to late 45, 46, were the men that you were assigned with, were they all starting to go home individually when they had enough
the
points?
older ones that had been in longer, yes, they left first. But most of them were the younger ones, and they didn't have the points.
Right.
Plus, we got some replacements that came in, too, and they were younger yet.
Yeah, and of course, you know, in these later stages, you're with the 9th Division, so you're not even with your original unit at all.
No, my original was disbanded.
Yeah.
We had to change our shoulder patches. For you always wore your patch on your left, so I'd take the halberd, which was the 65th Division, put that on your right shoulder, and then put the 9th Division patch on your left shoulder. And plus, they made you wear the decorations that the 9th Division won. Lanyards on each side, unit side, which we didn't have. And once I got home and that, I finally took them off my blouse.
Right.
I still got my blouse hanging in the closet.
All right. Okay. Now, are there other particular things that happened to you either before or after the war ended in Europe that kind of stand out in your mind that you haven't brought into the story here yet?
I don't know. Oh. I know that once we spent the winter after the war was over, that the Germans were pretty friendly, and they would do anything for food. So we had them. The GIs didn't have to do KP. They had Germans do KP. We went out and shot some of their deer, brought them in. We had venison. They fished in the rivers. We didn't in our supply of hand grenades, there wasn't any left because they come and drew them all out, and they used them to throw them in the creeks to get fish.
All right. Okay, so now we kind of get into the spring of 46, and you finally kind of get to go home. How did you get back home?
Well, I got back, and I think it was in a boxcar again. I'm trying to remember, or it was some kind of a, I can't remember exactly what kind of a vehicle, what kind of a train, but we went to Bremerhaven. And there it was a big Repel depot that were heading back. Of course, Camp Lucky Strike was another Repel depot, because then they were using that to send troops back home. I went to Bremerhaven, and then got assigned to a ship that was a a Victory ship, small one, you
Yeah.
know. And I think, I'm trying to remember if we had 3 meals a day there or 2 again. There, right? See, isn't that funny? I can't
Yeah.
remember.
Was the trip home any better than the trip over?
Oh yeah, it was relaxing. It was a little bit quicker. Didn't take 11 days to come back.
Yeah. Didn't have to zigzag anymore.
No zigzagging and no sleeping with your clothes all on and being ready to bail out. And everybody had you saw those pictures, they had those stuff hanging there. You could hardly get in and out. Then we had the funny part was we had the seasickness. They talked about that. So that's just mind over matter. We had one guy who preached that. He was in the bottom bunk, and the whole 11 days we hardly ever saw him. He was one of the ones that said like, mind over matter, seasickness.
All right. Now, what port did you land in when you got home? Did you go back to New York or somewhere else?
New Jersey.
Okay.
Camp Kilmer, New Jersey,
Yep.
I think.
A lot of guys went through there.
Yeah.
All right.
And we went through a buffet line, you know. We had steak.
Yeah.
That was
Yeah.
it. And we had German KPs serving us. And this one of the GIs made some comment about something, and this German GI says, it's rough in the U.S. And the guy says, wait till you get back to Germany.
All right. And then do they ship you home pretty quickly after that?
From there, yeah, it was only there for a very short period of time, and I went to Camp Atterbury, Indiana.
Right.
And my brother and my dad drove down and picked me up.
Okay. Now, once you got back home then, you're out of the service. What did you do next?
Well, for a few days, I didn't do much of anything. My mother was certainly glad to see me, and Dad, and I just kind of looked around. I had to buy some civilian clothes to wear, and I wasn't old enough to buy a drink, but I did go to a bar and get a drink down the street there. The friend took me down, and I was in uniform, so they didn't even question. But I got out in the 1st of May, and I wasn't 21 until October, so I was that period of time. Then I joined the VFW, I think, right after that, too.
Okay. Now, what kind of work did you go into?
The restaurant.
You stayed in the restaurants?
Yeah, well, worked with my dad and my brother in the restaurant, yeah.
And that was your working career then, was restaurant work?
No, I got tired of that, and I tried a record shop trying to sell records, and that flopped, and I went back into the restaurant. And then the freeway took the whole block out. I bought the beer license from my brother, and I moved to the next block. And I had a tavern there for 10 years. I got tired of that, so I sold that and got out of it. And my wife, in the meantime, she worked. I was married and then divorced, and so my current wife now worked selling laundry equipment, and so I got into the laundromat business and the dry cleaning business. I had bought the store on Bridge Street, and then we bought the 2 of them in Sparta. So for 14 years, I did the laundromat business, 7 days a week. I thought the tavern was bad with 6, so I got into the laundromat, and that was 7. So I used to drive to Sparta 7 days a week, and did that for 14 years, and sold it, and that's been like 25 years ago. And I worked once since I got out. I went to MC Sporting Goods to work. Maybe I shouldn't mention the name. And they said give me a pin cell. I was in charge of the sneakers. I didn't know one sneaker from another. I did that for a couple of weeks, and then they said I was scheduled to work on New Year's Day. New Year's Day, I watch football, so I watch football.
So you didn't really need that.
That was the last time I worked.
Right.
Oh, then I did work one more time for a while. A friend of mine that I knew made fishing lures, so I worked for him for a couple of months, and then ever since then I've been going to Florida for the winter now for the last 20 years or so.
All right. When you look back at the time that you spent in the Army, what kind of effect do you think that had on you?
Oh, I don't know. I think it made me, it made me much wiser, and I learned an awful lot, and I wouldn't go through it for $1 million, but I'm not sorry I did it.
That's a pretty common opinion. I've heard that from quite a few guys.
I would go through that again, freezing to death with no no bedding and no stove and no food, doing that for a couple of weeks, you know. And now when you go out when it's cold, I think about that once. I used to hunt somewhat, and I'd get a little cold, and it didn't seem to bother me as much.
Now, did you stay in touch with anybody from your unit or go to reunions?
Yes,
or things like
but
that?
they have a reunion every year in a different city. In this September, it's in Branson, Missouri, but I haven't gone for 5 or 6 years. I went to Louisville, Reno, San Diego, Biloxi, then I forget where else, but I haven't gone. Last year it was in Detroit, and I didn't even go.
Okay.
I didn't feel like spending $105 a night in a motel, at a hotel for a couple of nights.
All right. All right. Well, it makes for a good story. So I'd just like to close here by thanking you for coming in and telling it to me today.
Oh, I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.